speakers will deal with the encounter between Polanyi and Karl Marx. We will first listen to GARETH from Polanyi University on Marx, Polanyi, and Europe's immigration crisis. And then Andrea Komroshi will speak from the University of Vienna, revisiting surplus value and unpaid work. And finally, Sajjan Sinar from Central European University. The title of the talk is To Arrive at the Content, the Commune, Marxism, and Self-Government in Regressive. We will do like as in the previous panel, we'll collect questions at the end for reasons of expediency. Gareth, start.
Thanks. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation, especially to Attila Medek and to János for all the organization, and to Dorothea, who she wanted to attend this talk. She has to go and teach, but unfortunately, the last panel had 7 papers instead of 3. Meant that the time has moved on a little more than we expected. So my title is Marx, Polanyi, and Europe's immigration crisis, it's Marx's bicentennial year, so let's start with him. Marx was a refugee. He was expelled from France and was unable to return to Belgium or Germany. He was a refugee and he was a Jew. Is this relevant to my argument? Well, maybe. Isaac Deutscher, the Polish revolutionary, once asked in his essay, The Non-Jewish Jew, why are so many revolutionaries of modern political practice and political theory and culture more generally, why are so many revolutionaries Jewish? The answer he gave was that much of the Jewish experience in Europe at the time, in the early 20th century especially, was life lived on the margins, in the nooks and crannies of their respective nations, which helped construct a mentality that was peculiarly alive to social change and to contradictions. Now, more recently, a British sociologist, Satnam Verdi, has extended this argument in his book. It's a wonderful book, Racism, Class, and the Racialized Outsider. He's extended Deutscher's argument in general to what he calls racialized outsiders, who tend to be more attuned to national divisions and racial divisions, those divisions through which capitalist power is constructed. And this sensibility, he argues, is foundational to an internationalist socialist outlook. Now, internationalism. What is internationalism for Marx, or in Marx's work? First of all, it's a structural necessity for progressive social change, for socialist movements. It's not an ethical injunction. It's not something moralistic. It's a structural necessity. Why? Because capitalism is a form of society which is sustained by an international division of labor that is organized internationally through the production of difference, sustained and constructed by nation states through racial oppression. And so you cannot shut yourself somehow in capitalist society into the nation. You live in a world society, and therefore in order to build a serious challenge to this global system and to constitute a subject, a collective subject that is capable of creating a new world, that requires uncompromising and consistent solidarity with oppressed groups. In other words, not simply humanitarian sympathy, but seeing, understanding those groups as agents of resistance. Now, in Marx's work, which on this score is by no means always brilliant, particularly in his early years, but he increasingly, for example, came to see Ireland and the liberation of Ireland as a precondition for the liberation of the British working class. Or take the example of the American Civil War. You'd have thought that the workers of northwest England, in towns such as Manchester and so on, would have sided with the, had they placed their immediate interests first and foremost, you'd expect them to side with the South in the American Civil War, because that was the side producing the cheap cotton for the industries of Lancashire. But instead, a mass solidarity movement emerged with the North. So these questions of internationalism were absolutely central to Marx's politics. What would Marx be? How would Marx be viewing international questions today? Which ones would be first and foremost for him? Palestine might be one. One suspects, given its role for imperialism. Another one, I think, would be the question of immigrants and the general question of immigration policy. And I'm going to go back into the history of migration regimes to develop a particular take on this. So the political movement to which Marx was committed, known as at the time as social democracy, it began to crystallize organizationally in the very same period in which states were gaining a much more defined national core in the late 19th century, early 20th century. This was an era of heightened geopolitical competition and of the dissolution of empires. It was also the era that saw the rise of the social question. All middle-class eyes at the time were on the frightful products of industrialization, on the workers with their poverty, their rude habits and habitats, their criminal tendencies, their licentiousness, their unruliness, and so on. The social question at the time was, in a sense, the political face of poverty. That's Hannah Arendt's phrase. And how do we normally think of it having been resolved? We think of it having been resolved through political institutions, through public policy, through welfare measures, incorporating workers as citizens into the state, and in some cases as well through democratization, raising the working class within the state and granting dignity through citizenship and welfare. Now, naturally, all of this was very attractive to social democratic movements, quite rightly so, and was pushed by them to a considerable degree, but it came with a catch. The people of 19th century Europe were already in the process of being constituted as national subjects in bourgeois states. These constructs had developed in opposition to other nations and states, and in close connection with empires. In other words, the people were being constituted not only in opposition to dynastic rule or imperial rule, but also laterally in antagonism to other peoples. And it was on this lattice that the social question was resolved in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was resolved by interpolating workers as clients through the welfare system, as atomized voters through parliamentary democracy, and as individual citizens of bourgeois states, states which over centuries had become shaped around ruling class interests and were defined in rivalry against other states, with nationhood becoming the political and cultural glue of all this. So what I'm suggesting is that the social question should be turned around and looked at as a problem of controlling the masses, to look after the poor and needy, to elevate them, but in so doing, to turn them against the poor and needy elsewhere. For how much more manageable would industrial capitalist society be if workers could see other workers in the way that the upper classes see them? So our workers fear their poverty and foreign habits, their criminal inclinations, their diseases, their unruliness, etc. And so it's little wonder that the era of immigration controls arrived not only in an era of clamorous geopolitical rivalry, but also in an era of democratization. Now, this set of circumstances posed a dilemma for the socialist movement, and a divide opened up. It was essentially the same divide as opened up over war. Both questions of war and immigration ask, what should we do when our state seeks to manage the bodies of foreign workers? Should we march into battle and kill them? Should we support borders that control their entry and exit and brand them as lower status, as foreigners? Now, the German Social Democratic Party at its Stuttgart Congress in 1907, it passed a resolution that opposed border controls. But just as its anti-war resolutions were thrown away in 1914, as everyone knows, its anti-racist resolutions were discarded at the same time. They were completely forgotten when Social Democratic government entered office after the First World War. And this was the way in which social democracy as a movement was welded through nationalism to supporting capitalism. And the workers of Germany and Europe and beyond were unmade as a class. We sometimes hear of the making of the working class, but this involved unmaking of the working class. Only a small minority, the likes of Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, James Connolly, and Lenin, resisted this trend. In Hungary, you had a small current of this sort as well. It was represented by Odi Endre and Szabó Erdőn. Forgive my pronunciation. The Austrian social democratic leader Otto Bauer was an epitome of the other side of the argument, the nationalist side. His book on the national question argued that, well, workers are always going to be nationalists, so socialists should embrace the idea of the nation. And what did this lead him to do? To lead Austrian and Hungarian workers into war in August 1914, to follow him to the front, where he was proud to serve as an officer. He even earned a military cross, and others, followed suit. In Hungary, Karl Polanyi, for example, marched with Bauer into war as an officer, cheerfully, proudly, nationalistically, as a patriot, as a supporter of empire. And in Polanyi's case, also a supporter of Magyar hegemony. And similarly apply, I mean, I'm having a pop at Polanyi here. I'm a great admirer of many aspects of his work, of his intellectual output, but not always of his politics, and certainly not in support for an absolutely ghastly war. Similarly on migration, in Mechanismen der Wirtschaftskrise, Polanyi implies that, or argues that immigration control is somehow protective of society, which I think is a very dangerous move to go down, because immigration control is the central organizing institution of racism in the world today. Now, if the 1907 Stuttgart Resolution set a fine example to us, how can it be applied today? Well, today the world is quite different to the world in 1907, and migration regimes are very different as well. A century ago, Europe's states were national, but they were also imperial. Now they are national, and they're also member states of the EU. And the EU itself is new. It's an odd creature, a hybrid creature. Is it a federation? Yes, but with aspects of empire and almost a nation state, and certainly an ultra-imperialism as well in Karl Kautsky's sense. Just look at the EU's migration regime. It is a continuation of the migration regimes of the imperial nation states that set up the EU. So just as in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Poles and Algerians were drafted to labor in Germany and France. Nowadays, Hungarians and Poles go to Germany and Italy to work. And the movements of people from Eastern Europe to Germany or to Britain today, we can hear echoes of, for example, the 1840s Irish workers moving to Britain. In that decade, in the 1840s, London applied, well, the British government applied the liberal market rule book across famine-hit Ireland, and this exacerbated the starvation there and caused hundreds of thousands of Irish people to flee to Britain, where they were put to work on poverty wages, digging canals and laying rail. For London in those days, we can read Brussels and Frankfurt today. For Ireland in those days, we can read Eastern Europe and Southern Europe today. For canals, digging canals and laying railroad, or railways I should say, we can read skinning chickens, cleaning offices today. In each case, the goal is to seek out skilled or cheap and mobile labor and integrate them into the national and EU division of labor, while simultaneously coding them into national ethnic hierarchies. And that coding always draws on Europe's imperial past. This means that while EU free movement is, of course, welcome to us in very immediate, personal, practical ways. I mean, I was able to come here after a lecture at my university in London last night that ended at 7 p.m. and yet I could still come here and, you know, come to the conference. Of course, in those ways, it's very welcome, but as an institution, it is fundamentally racist. It's not just that it's an EU institution and the EU is a racist white Christian club. Remember Konrad Adenauer, who was crucial to setting up the EU. Germany must lead in the EU, which will enable us Germans to impress, I'm quoting Adenauer, impress the stamp of a Christian ideology on the EU, or on the EEC in those days. It's much more than that. The free movement regime itself, when it began to be set up in the 1950s, was absolutely racist to the core. The Treaty of Rome promised a right of free movement to workers within the EEC. Algeria was at the time a colony of France, so it was part of the EEC. But if free movement of Algerians was permitted in the EEC, that would undermine the racist exclusions on which the EEC was founded. Therefore, they rewrote the Treaty of Rome to exclude Algerians from free movement. That's how racist to the core this institution is. So we see then that the EU only redesigns the old divisions, reimposing immigration control in brutal racist ways at the external border. Now, some theorists go further than I'm going and argue that EU free movement is peculiarly evil, uniquely evil, that the EU represents a reactionary antithesis to the sovereign, democratic, and therefore progressive space of the nation state. I'm thinking of people like Wolfgang Streeck. But what this argument misses is that the nation state itself is the political cornerstone of global capitalist order. The world system is constituted and is continually recreated through articulations of the global and the national, and in the case of the EU, the regional as well. So, 2 minutes left. What does all this mean for the left? I think a good place to start would be the Die Linke manifesto of 2011, which argues that a Die Linke-led government would reject, I quote, a politics of migration and integration that only grants social and political rights to individuals deemed useful to capital. Instead, they argue open borders for people in need and open borders for all. But that the politics of their everyday practice is a very far cry from that. In Thüringen, Thuringia, the Linke-led government called for an immigration law to ensure that immigrants are selected for their ability to fill skilled labor shortages. And the same organization participates in federal deportations of immigrants. So it's you know, the dilemma is clear. And the best-known leader of Die Linke, you probably know Zahra Wagenknecht, is notorious for her ability to swerve really quite far right on matters of race and immigration. I always find intriguing the fact that her political formation was the most decisive moment for Wagenknecht was 9th of November 1989, a moment of, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, a moment of an uncontrolled border opening. And these very same words, uncontrolled border opening, are Wagenknecht's critique of the permission of the German state for Syrian refugees to come into Germany. I'm not suggesting for a moment that open borders should suffice as a simple campaign slogan. You know, for the time being, borders are here to stay. We can't wish them away any more than we can wish states away or wish capitalism away. Those institutions are inseparable. However, social movements can push on a range of fronts. They can build networks, build confidence, build pro-migrant solidarity in workplaces and communities, and recreate a culture of anti-racist internationalism, which we have seen arise at key moments in history. Rebuilding cosmopolitanisms from below, for example, through trade unions, which we've seen in Germany, fantastic examples of trade unions organizing for the right to vote for migrants. We see it in little acts of charity, in support for refugees, in campaigns against deportations. We see it more incredibly impressively in Barcelona last year when protesters marched en masse to urge the Spanish government to take in many more refugees. And here you saw proof that anti-racism and migrant solidarity can attract mass support. Mass support. It gives a glimpse of the potential for broader struggle against the EU's border control regime. These were movements that offered glimpses of forms of collective agency that can counter the hold of the national on the imagination of the left. They can begin to create shared practices and demands and strategies that can overcome the divisions of ethnicity and establish practical unity. And in all this, the struggles of migrants themselves, of course, are central. What I'm arguing, and I'll finish on this, is that these sorts of struggles are essential to the constitution if we want to constitute political subjects which are capable of challenging capital on an internationalist basis. That means collective subjects that don't orient themselves around nation, state, and ethnos, around the architecture of the existing order, but around solidarity networks in the present and transformative projects of the future. Thanks.